I never imagined that the person who would try to dismantle everything I had spent my life building would be the same person I had once driven to the emergency room at 2 a.m, held her hair back while she was sick, and told, over and over and over again, in the particular way that mothers tell their children things they need to believe, that everything was going to be all right. I never imagined it would be my own daughter. My name is Elizabeth S. Holloway. I am 72 years old. I wake at 5:45 every morning without an alarm. I make coffee, dark roast, 2 cups, no sugar, and I take the second cup out to the back porch of my house in Franklin, Tennessee, where I sit in the wooden chair my husband Raymond built the summer before his diagnosis, and I watch the light come up over the ridge. I do this every single morning. Rain, cold, the particular gray Tuesdays of November when the sky looks like it hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be. I am not confused. I am not frail. I am not a woman who needs to be managed. But my daughter had decided otherwise. Her name is Diane. She is 47 years old. She is married to a man named Patrick, who has the particular charm of someone who has never quite committed to becoming anything specific, and who has therefore spent his adult life moving laterally between opportunities that each seemed at the time like the one that would finally resolve into something. I had watched this pattern for 22 years without saying a word. It was not my place. Diane was an adult. Patrick was her husband. Adults make their own choices, and the choices they live inside are not their mother's business. But the house they lived in, 40 minutes from mine, in a subdivision that announced its aspirations through its gate and its landscaping, was slightly beyond what their combined income could consistently sustain. I knew this the way you know things about your children that they have never directly told you, through the particular language of what they do not say. The twice postponed vacation, the careful subject changes when certain topics came up, the way Diane's eyes moved when Patrick talked about his next venture with the specific enthusiasm of someone trying to convince himself. Raymond and I had built our home over 39 years of marriage. We had paid it off. We had watched it become, in the way that Tennessee land becomes when you hold it long enough and the city grows in your direction, worth considerably more than it had been when we signed those first papers at a folding table in a realtor's office in 1984. Raymond knew about the value. I knew about it, and Diane knew about it. Raymond died of a stroke on a Wednesday morning in March, 4 years ago. He was in the garden. He had gone out early before I woke, because that was his way. He liked the garden in the morning before the heat came. And I had learned over 39 years not to try to change the things that were fundamental to a person. I found him when I brought his coffee out. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. I held his hand in the garden until they came. I drove myself home from the hospital that afternoon. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I fed the dog. I called Diane. I called our pastor. I did what needed to be done, because that is what you do when the thing you were most afraid of losing has finally been lost, and the world has not stopped turning, and the dog still needs to be fed. I grieved. I am still grieving, in the quiet way that does not announce itself, but simply lives in the particular empty quality of certain moments. The second cup of coffee that no one else is drinking, the chair on the porch that still holds the shape of someone who sat in it for 30 years. I did not fall apart. That, I think, was Diane's first mistake. She had expected me to fall apart. And when I didn't, when I continued to manage my own house and my own finances and my own life with the same competence I had always managed them with, she had to adjust her approach. The adjustments began slowly, so slowly that I almost missed them. In the first months after Raymond died, Diane called every few days. She came on Sunday afternoons. She sat with me in the kitchen while I baked the sourdough I have been making from the same starter for 14 years. She brought food, casseroles, soups, the particular gestures of a daughter trying to demonstrate that she was present and caring and paying attention. It felt like something we had not had in a long time. I want to say that clearly and honestly because it matters to the story. Those months felt good. They felt like a reopening of something that had been partially closed for years, as we had both gotten busier and older and more settled into the separate grooves of our separate lives. I was grateful for her presence. I told her so. I should have paid closer attention to when the questions changed. It started small, the way these things always start. Had I thought about whether the house might be more than I needed now that it was just me? Did I find the maintenance daunting? The yard was large. Did I have help with it? What about the winters? I told her the house was exactly the right size because it was my home, and I knew every room of it. I told her I had a yard service on a schedule. I told her my neighbor Frank checked on me twice a week, and that I had chosen, entirely on my own initiative, to wear a medical alert device that I had researched and purchased myself. She would nod. She would change the subject, but she always came back. It was in January, 14 months after Raymond died, that I began to understand what the questions were actually about. She and Patrick came together that time. A Saturday morning. Diane brought muffins she had made herself, which was unusual. Diane did not often bake, and when she did, it was for a specific occasion. Patrick stood by the kitchen counter with his hands in his pockets, and he was doing something I had noticed before in people who are present at a conversation they have rehearsed but are not quite comfortable performing. He was looking at approximately everything in the room except me. Diane sat down across from me. She had a folder. Not a file folder. Something more formal. A document folder. The kind you use when you want what is inside to look official. She set it on the table between us with the particular deliberateness of someone who has practiced the gesture. She folded her hands. She said, "Mom, we need to talk about the future." I told her I was comfortable talking about the future. She said she and Patrick had been worried, genuinely worried, she said, awake at night worrying about what would happen if something happened to me. She talked about the house. She talked about the assets. She talked about accounts and property and access and the complexity of managing things when time was of the essence. She talked for perhaps 6 minutes without stopping, which told me the speech had been prepared in advance and that she had been worried if she stopped that she might lose the thread. Then she opened the folder. Inside was a document, several pages, printed on good paper with a letterhead I did not recognize at the top. She slid it across the table toward me. "It's a power of attorney," she said. "It would let us help you manage things, just in case something happened." I looked at the document. I looked at my daughter. I looked at Patrick, who was still finding other things to look at. I said, "In case of what, specifically?" She said, "In case you ever couldn't make decisions for yourself, Mom. You're 72. We just want to make sure we can step in if we need to." I asked who had prepared the document. She said she and Patrick had had it drawn up. I asked who the attorney represented, me or them. There was a pause. The kind of pause that in 36 years of working in medical offices and legal offices and the various administrative spaces where documents have consequences, I had learned to pay very close attention to. She said, "It's for your benefit, Mom. It would just give us the ability to act if something happened." I picked up the folder. I said I would need some time to look it over carefully before I made any decisions. I said this pleasantly. I stood, and I moved toward the counter where the bread I had made that morning was cooling, and I cut a loaf and wrapped it in cloth and held it out to Diane. She looked like she wanted to say more. Patrick uncrossed and recrossed his arms. I thanked them for coming. I walked them to the door. I watched their car pull out of my driveway. Then I sat down at the kitchen table with the folder, and I read every page. I had spent 36 years as the office manager for a medical and legal practice in Nashville. I am not an attorney, but I know how to read a document. I know what phrases mean. I know the difference between language that protects the person signing and language that protects the person named. By the third page, I had a feeling in my stomach that I recognized from the years I had spent reviewing documents on behalf of doctors and attorneys needed someone to catch what the other party was trying to slip past them. The document was broad, very broad. It gave Diane authority over my financial accounts, my real property, my medical decisions, my investments. It included language that allowed her to act not only in the event of incapacity, but in circumstances that were defined so loosely as to allow action at almost any time. There was a clause about real property that allowed the agent, Diane, to transfer, sell, or otherwise dispose of real property on behalf of the principal. I read that sentence 4 times. Then I sat at my kitchen table alone, in the house Raymond and I had built over 39 years, and I thought about my daughter sitting across from me with her hands folded and her rehearsed speech and the folder she had set on the table with such careful deliberateness. I thought about Patrick by the counter not meeting my eyes. I thought about the house they lived in, the gate, the landscaping, the ventures that kept not quite resolving into something. I did not cry. I was not ready to cry yet. What I felt was more like the particular cold clarity that comes when you have been trying to believe something and can no longer maintain the effort. I put the document back in the folder. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea. I sat with what I now knew. The next morning, I called my friend Margaret Sutton. Margaret is 74 years old and has been my closest friend since we were both young women living on the same street in a neighborhood that no longer exists in quite the same form. She is the kind of friend who has seen you through enough that you do not need to explain context. She already has all the context. She listened to everything I told her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Elizabeth, you need your own attorney, not theirs. Yours, someone who represents you and nobody else." I said, "I know." She said, "Do you want me to come with you?" I said, "Yes." 3 days later, Margaret drove me to the office of an elder law attorney named Dr. Catherine Wells. Catherine Wells was 61 years old and had spent 28 years doing exactly one thing: protecting older adults from financial exploitation and the legal maneuvers that enabled it. She had an office full of plants in a manner that was simultaneously warm and precise in a way I found immediately reassuring. The manner of someone who has seen enough of what she sees, that she has moved past anger into competence. I laid the document on her desk. I told her everything. She read the document with the focused stillness of someone who reads documents like this regularly enough that each line registers against a catalog of patterns she has spent decades building. She looked up at me over her reading glasses. She said, "Mrs. Holloway, this document would give your daughter access to your assets, including your real property, in circumstances that are not limited to incapacity. Do you have any reason to believe she may be experiencing significant financial pressure?" I thought about the gate, the landscaping, Patrick's ventures. I said, "Yes." Catherine set the document down and told me several things. She told me I had every right not to sign anything I had not had independently reviewed. She told me that if I ever chose to establish any legal instruments, they should be drawn up by an attorney who represented me alone. She told me about the legal tools that actually protected people in my position: a revocable living trust, specific and limited power of attorney with conditions I controlled, updated beneficiary designations, a clearly documented estate plan that could not be altered by pressure or persuasion. And then she said something I have returned to many times since. She said, "Mrs. Holloway, I want you to understand something about how financial exploitation of older adults typically works. It rarely begins with cruelty. It almost always begins with love, or what presents itself as love. The person doing it usually believes on some level that they are entitled to what they're pursuing. That makes it harder to see and harder to name, but the law does not make exceptions for well-intentioned entitlement." I looked at her. I said, "What do I do?" She said, "You let me help you protect yourself, quietly, before anyone knows it's happening." Over the following 8 weeks, Catherine Wells and I built something: a revocable living trust that placed my home and my primary assets under a structure that could not be transferred or accessed without my explicit consent while I was living incapable. An updated will with clear documentation of my intentions and the reasoning behind them. A durable power of attorney, limited, specific, covering only the circumstances I defined, assigned not to Diane, but to Margaret, who had been my closest friend for 45 years and whose judgment I trusted completely. Updated beneficiary designations on every account. A letter, drafted with Catherine's guidance, documenting my mental and legal capacity and my deliberate, uncoerced decision to structure my affairs in exactly this way. Copies of everything in a fireproof safe in my closet. A second set at Catherine's office. During those 8 weeks, Diane called regularly. I answered every call. I was warm. I was present. I told her I was still reviewing the document and thinking carefully about the right approach. She was patient. That told me she was confident. She had no idea what was being built while she waited. There was a Sunday in March when Diane came over alone. She sat at my kitchen table in the afternoon light, and she looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has decided to abandon the prepared speech and say the true thing. She said, "Mom, I need to be honest with you." I said, "Please." She said, Patrick and I are really struggling. The business didn't work out the way we thought. The house payments are getting hard to manage. We're scared, Mom. And I keep thinking, you're going to leave everything to me eventually anyway. We just need some way to access things now. Just as a safety net. Just so we don't lose everything we've built. I sat across from my daughter, and I looked at her face. The face I had watched change from the face of an infant to the face of a toddler, to the face of a girl who broke her arm falling from a tree in our backyard, and cried not from pain, but from frustration that the fall had been her own fault. I had loved this face for 47 years. I still loved it, and I felt something that I do not have a better word for than heartbreak. Not because she had asked, but because of what the asking revealed about how she had come to see me as a resource, as a structure to be accessed, as something with a value that was primarily financial and a presence that was primarily an obstacle to that value. I had not become this to her overnight. This had happened slowly, over years, through the accumulation of choices so small that neither of us had seen the shape they were making until the shape was already there. I took a slow breath. I said, I understand you're frightened. I understand things are hard. I love you, Diane, and I am sorry for the difficulty you're in. She looked at me with the relief of someone who believes they are about to hear yes. I said, the document you brought me is not something I'm going to sign, but I want you to know that I am working with my own attorney on an estate plan, and you will be taken care of when the time comes. That has not changed. The relief faded. She said, Mom? I said, I think we need to leave it there for today. She left, not angrily, but with the particular frustration of someone who had prepared for a different outcome. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car disappear down the driveway. Then I sat down at the table and I let myself cry, not from anger, not from fear, but from the particular grief of loving someone clearly and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what they had been doing. 6 weeks later, things changed. Diane called on a Tuesday afternoon and said she and Patrick had been thinking, and they had a new idea. A simpler approach, she said. Something that would help everyone. They wanted me to sign the house over to her as a gift. She explained it the way people explain things they have rehearsed when they believe the explanation would be sufficient. She said I could keep living there. She said it would simplify the estate process. She said it was really just a matter of paperwork. I noticed that she did not mention the mortgage, because there was no mortgage. The house had been paid off for 17 years. She had forgotten that detail, or had not known it, which told me that Patrick had provided the framework of the plan without fully understanding the specifics of what he was working with. I told her I appreciated her thinking about it, and I would need to discuss it with my attorney. She said, You have an attorney? I said, Yes, I do. There was a pause. Since when? Since January, I said pleasantly. Another pause, longer. Mom, this doesn't need to be complicated. I know, I said. I'll let you know what Catherine says. I called Catherine the next morning. I told her about the house signing proposal. Catherine listened. When I finished, she said, Mrs. Holloway, I want to make sure you understand something. What your daughter is now proposing, asking you to transfer real property to her as a gift while you are living under financial pressure, meets the legal definition of financial elder abuse under Tennessee Code. That is not a characterization. That is what the statute describes. I said, What does that mean for what I do next? She said, It means we document this conversation. And it means I think it's time to have a different kind of conversation with your daughter, one where she understands clearly what the legal reality is. I thought about Diane's face, about the 47 years of loving it. I said, I want to handle this myself first. Will you help me prepare? Catherine said, Tell me what you want to say. I called Diane that Friday. I asked her and Patrick to come on Saturday morning. I told her it was important. I told her I had made a decision. I could hear the hope in her voice, the particular quality of hope that belongs to someone who has been waiting for an outcome and believes it is finally arriving. Of course, Mom, she said. We'll be there at 10. I spent Friday evening preparing. I made coffee. I baked bread, sourdough, from the starter I have kept alive for 14 years, the one I began the year Raymond and I celebrated our 25th anniversary. I set the table. I placed my fireproof safe on the kitchen counter. I went to bed at 10 o'clock, and I slept better than I had slept in months. They arrived at 10 sharp. Diane was wearing the particular kind of careful casual that people wear when they are trying to appear relaxed about something they are not relaxed about. Patrick had the expression of a man who has been told things are going well and is choosing to believe it. I let them settle. I poured coffee. I set bread on a plate. I let Diane begin to ask if I had made a decision. Then I opened the safe. I placed the documents on the table, one at a time, not hurriedly, not dramatically, with the careful, methodical pace of someone who has spent 36 years organizing documents that mattered and understands that the way you present something affects whether it is received. First, the trust documents, the revocable living trust that now held the title to my home and my primary assets. I explained briefly what it was and what it did. Second, the updated will. I told them Christine was named as the primary beneficiary, as she always would have been. I told her that had not changed. Third, the limited power of attorney, naming Margaret, not Diane, as the designated agent. I explained the specific and limited conditions under which it applied. Fourth, a letter from Catherine's office summarizing the legal status of my estate and the documentation of my capacity and my uncoerced intent. Fifth, a single page that I placed last, deliberately. A summary, prepared by Catherine, of Tennessee Code Section 71-6102 and related statutes governing financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. I did not say anything about it. I simply placed it where they could read it. Patrick looked at the last page and then looked at his coffee. I said, "My estate is in order. The house will go to Diane through the trust when the time comes, as it always would have. No assets will be transferred while I am alive and capable of managing my own affairs. That is my decision. It is documented, it is legal, and it will not change." I looked at Diane. "I know you are frightened," I said. "I know things are hard. I know Patrick's work has not been what you hoped. I am your mother, and I love you, and I am sorry you are going through this. But I will not solve it by dismantling what your father and I built. That is not an option I will ever put on the table." The kitchen was very quiet. The bread was on the plate between us, untouched. Diane looked at the documents. She looked at me. She looked at the last page, the one from Catherine's office with the statute summary, and something moved through her face that I had not seen there before. Not anger, not frustration, something softer. Something more like a person being shown for the first time the shape of what they have been doing, and not being able to argue with the shape. Patrick said nothing. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. After a long moment, Diane said, "Mom, I didn't mean for it to." "I know," I said. "I was scared. I know you were. I wasn't thinking about Diane." I waited until she looked at me. "I know what you were thinking about. You were thinking about your house and your payments and what would happen if things kept going the way they were going. I understand that. But you stopped thinking about me. And I need you to understand that I noticed." She pressed her hands flat on the table. She was trying not to cry. I let her try. Then I said, "The coffee is getting cold, and the bread is better warm." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached for the bread. They left 2 hours later. It was not a warm parting. It was not a repaired one. It was something more honest than either of those things. The particular awkward quiet of people who have been through something together that cannot be unseen and are not yet sure what it means for what comes next. I stood at the kitchen window and watched their car back out of the driveway, and I stayed there for a long time after it had gone. Then I called Margaret. She answered on the second ring. I told her everything that had happened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about that question honestly. "Tired," I said, "and something else. Something I don't have a word for yet." Margaret said, "That's probably what it feels like when you've been carrying something for a long time and you finally put it down." I thought about that. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what it is." The weeks that followed were quiet in a way that had a different quality from the previous quiet. Diane did not call for 2 weeks. When she did, her voice was different. Less rehearsed, less careful in the particular way that people are careful when they are managing toward an outcome. She called on a Thursday evening, and she asked how I was, and I told her I was fine, and she said she had been thinking a lot. I said, "About what?" She said, "About Dad, about the house, about what you said, that you noticed." I waited. She said, "I've been thinking about what it must have felt like for you. When I brought that folder, when Patrick and I showed up with that document, what you must have thought." I said, "What do you think I thought?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said that we were treating you like something with a value instead of someone we loved. I let that sit between us for a moment. "Yes," I said, "that is what it felt like." She said, "I'm sorry, Mom." Not the kind of sorry that is looking for absolution, the kind that is not asking for anything in return. I had learned over 72 years to tell the difference, and I could tell the difference. I said, "I know you are. I don't know how to fix it." "You don't fix it all at once," I said. "You just make different choices, starting now. And you let the different choices accumulate into something I can trust." She said, "Okay." I said, "Okay." Patrick found a position with a logistics firm in Nashville 3 months after that Saturday morning. Steady work. Benefits. The kind of employment that does not require anyone to perform confidence about whether it will resolve into something. It is already something. They began working with a financial counselor to restructure their debt and their spending. Diane called to tell me about it, not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. I understood the difference. The house, their house, stabilized. The refinancing came through at a better rate. The particular financial terror that had been driving the previous year began to recede, the way financial terror does when the income is reliable and the expenditure is managed. Diane came for Easter. We baked together in the kitchen. We made the sourdough and the lemon cake Raymond had always requested, and the peanut butter cookies that were Diane's childhood favorite, and that she claimed to have outgrown but had not. We ate at the kitchen table with the afternoon light coming through the window, and we talked about Raymond, about the garden, about what I was reading, about a trip Diane and Patrick were planning to take that was modest and within their means and planned honestly. At one point, Diane looked at the table, the same table where the folder had been placed, and she said quietly, "I've been thinking about Dad, about what he would have thought about all of this." I said, "What do you think he would have thought?" She was quiet for a moment. "That he built this house to take care of you, not to be taken from you." I looked at my daughter. I said, "Yes, that's exactly right." She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. We stayed like that for a moment, the two of us in the kitchen that had held 47 years of our history, in the house that Raymond had built to last, in the afternoon light that came in every day at that angle, regardless of what had happened the day before. Then Diane said, "Tell me about the sourdough. I want to learn how to do it properly." I laughed, the first real laugh in a long time. "You have to be patient," I said. "It takes longer than you think, but the starter keeps going. You just have to take care of it." She nodded. "Teach me." "All right," I said. "Let's start from the beginning." I'm still in my house. I still wake at 5:45. I still make the coffee strong enough to wake the neighbors. I still take the second cup to the porch Raymond built, and I sit in his chair, and I watch the light come up over the ridge, and I think about things, the way you think about things when you have reached the age where there is enough behind you to give the present a particular kind of depth. My trust is fully established. My estate is in order. Catherine Wells sends me a card every Christmas, and I send one back. Margaret and I walk on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the same walk, the same route, the same conversations that have been slowly building for 45 years into something that is more like a continuous understanding than a series of separate exchanges. And on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, when the light comes up over the ridge and the coffee is strong and Margaret is at my door in her walking shoes and the world is quiet and mine, it is enough. It is more than enough. If this story reached something in you, if you recognized something in it that belongs to your own life, please do not sit with that recognition alone. Elder law attorneys exist for exactly this reason. You do not need to be in a crisis. You do not need to have already lost something. The time to protect yourself is before anyone gives you a reason to think you need to. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me what this story gave you. And share it with someone who needs to hear that their age is not a weakness. It is the most complete version of themselves.